It began with a meeting so secret that even senior palace aides were told to stay away. Behind closed doors, King Charles III gathered a handful of trusted figures to discuss the future of the monarchy. Hours later, Princess Anne emerged visibly shaken, her usually unbreakable composure nowhere to be seen. What decision could leave the monarchy's toughest guardian frozen in disbelief? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For generations, the British monarchy has survived because its biggest decisions were carefully managed, quietly prepared, and revealed only when the moment was right. But according to growing whispers from inside royal circles, this meeting felt different from the very beginning. Long before King Charles arrived, unusual instructions had reportedly been issued throughout the palace. Senior aides were redirected. Schedules were suddenly altered. Even individuals who normally had access to sensitive discussions found themselves excluded from what was taking place. The atmosphere surrounding the gathering carried a sense of urgency that many had never witnessed before. At the center of it all stood King Charles himself. Ever since concerns about his health became impossible to ignore, questions about the future of the crown had quietly intensified behind the scenes. Publicly, the monarchy projected stability and confidence. Privately, however, conversations about succession, legacy, and the long-term future of the institution were becoming increasingly difficult to avoid. The king understood better than anyone that the crown could not afford uncertainty. Every decision made now would shape the monarchy for decades to come. Only a small inner circle was invited into the confidential meeting. Among them was Princess Anne, widely regarded as one of the most dependable and disciplined members of the royal family. Anne had spent her entire life protecting the institution through moments of triumph and crisis alike. She was known for remaining calm when others panicked, steady when others wavered. That reputation made what happened afterward all the more startling. As the meeting continued behind closed doors, speculation began spreading through the corridors of the palace. Staff members noticed unusual levels of security surrounding the discussion. Questions were met with silence. Requests for information were politely dismissed. The secrecy itself became a story. The more people were told nothing unusual was happening, the more they suspected the opposite was true. Then came the moment that would ignite a storm of rumors. When Princess Anne finally emerged, those who saw her immediately sensed something had changed. She spoke little. She offered no reassurance. Her expression, normally controlled and unreadable, appeared burdened by thoughts she was unwilling, or perhaps unable to, share. For a woman known for her resilience, the silence spoke louder than words ever could. Within hours, whispers began spreading among royal observers and incisors. Some believed the king had reached a final decision regarding the line of succession. Others suggested that preparations were already underway for changes far greater than anyone outside the palace understood. Nobody seemed to know the full truth, but one thing became increasingly clear. This was not a routine discussion. Something significant had happened behind those closed doors. As speculation intensified, senior royal insiders quietly began suggesting that the monarchy might be standing at the edge of a historic turning point. Decisions once considered years away suddenly felt immediate. Assumptions that had guided royal watchers for decades were being questioned. The future that many believed was already written no longer seemed certain. And while the public remained unaware of the details, those closest to the institution could feel the ground shifting beneath them. But what Charles revealed behind those closed doors was not a sudden decision. It was the culmination of years of private tensions, hidden concerns, and a plan nobody expected. For decades, Princess Anne had been the monarchy's most dependable defender, standing firm through scandals, crises, and uncertainty. Yet even she knew that King Charles's illness had forced difficult conversations about the future. What she didn't know was just how far those conversations had already gone. The rumors that exploded after the secret meeting refused to disappear. Instead, they grew louder with each passing day, feeding a sense of uncertainty that had begun to spread through royal circles. For Princess Anne, however, this was not simply another wave of speculation. She had spent her entire life inside the institution. She understood better than most how rumors were born, how they evolved, and how they often faded without consequence. But this felt different. The reaction she witnessed from those closest to the king suggested that something far more significant was unfolding beneath the surface. Anne had dedicated decades to protecting the stability of the crown. Through family controversies, public criticism, and moments when confidence in the monarchy appeared fragile, she remained one of its strongest defenders. Duty had never been a slogan for her. It was a responsibility that shaped every decision she made. While others came and went, Anne remained a constant presence, carrying the weight of tradition without complaint. That unwavering commitment was precisely why the events surrounding Charles's confidential meeting unsettled her so deeply. The reality was impossible to ignore. Since the king's health challenges became a matter of growing concern, discussions about the future had intensified behind palace walls. Public appearances continued, official duties carried on. Yet beneath the surface, preparations were quietly accelerating. The monarchy had always relied on careful planning, especially during periods of uncertainty. But what Anne was beginning to discover suggested that these preparations had progressed much further than anyone outside a very small circle realized. Private reviews of succession procedures had reportedly been taking place for months. Constitutional experts, trusted advisors, and senior officials were said to be examining every possible scenario. Questions that once belonged to the distant future were now being treated with increasing urgency. The focus was no longer simply on what would happen one day. The focus had shifted toward what might need to happen sooner than expected. At the center of these discussions stood Prince William. As heir to the throne, his growing involvement was inevitable. Yet even Anne noticed how dramatically his role had expanded. More responsibilities were quietly moving in his direction. More strategic conversations seemed to include his voice. More decisions carried signs of his influence. To outside observers, these changes appeared natural. To Anne, they hinted at something larger taking shape behind closed doors. For years, she believed she understood her brother's intentions. Charles had always valued continuity. He respected tradition while carefully embracing modernization where necessary. Anne assumed his plans would follow a familiar path, steady, predictable, and rooted in established royal practice. But the information now reaching her challenged those assumptions. The deeper she looked, the more she encountered fragments of a vision that seemed far more ambitious than anyone expected. What troubled her most was not the possibility of change itself. The monarchy had survived because it adapted when necessary. What troubled her was the scale of what appeared to be under consideration. Every new detail seemed to point toward a future that could reshape long-standing expectations, alter traditional roles, and redefine how the institution would function for generations to come. As Anne quietly pieced together the puzzle, an uncomfortable realization began taking hold. The meeting that had left her shaken was not focused solely on preparing for the next chapter. It was focused on rewriting parts of the story altogether. And if that was true, then the consequences would reach far beyond the current generation of royals, setting the stage for revelations that would soon leave even seasoned palace insiders struggling to comprehend what was coming next. The deeper Anne looked into the situation, the more she realized that the king's plan stretched far beyond a simple transfer of power. When details of the king's final succession strategy began circulating among senior royals, disbelief spread quickly through palace corridors. It wasn't merely about who would wear the crown next. It was about how the monarchy itself would be reshaped. The realization struck gradually at first, then all at once. What Princess Anne had initially believed to be a carefully managed succession plan was revealing itself as something much larger and far more ambitious. Fragments of information began emerging from different corners of the royal household, and each new detail seemed to confirm the same unsettling truth. King Charles was not simply preparing for the eventual transfer of the crown. He appeared to be laying the foundation for a monarchy that would operate differently long after he was gone. Those closest to the institution found themselves struggling to comprehend the scale of the proposal. For generations, royal succession had followed a path that, while occasionally adjusted by circumstance, remained anchored in centuries of tradition. The framework Charles was reportedly discussing reached beyond immediate concerns and into the distant future. It involved not only the next reign, but the generations that would follow. Every branch of the family seemed connected to the discussion in some way, making the implications impossible to ignore. As word quietly spread among senior royals, reactions varied dramatically. Some viewed the king's thinking as bold leadership during an uncertain period. They argued that every successful monarch understood the importance of preparing for challenges before they arrived. In their eyes, Charles was doing exactly that. Rather than allowing future generations to inherit unresolved questions, he was attempting to provide direction, structure, and stability for decades to come. Others, however, were far less convinced. Behind private conversations and carefully guarded discussions, concerns began emerging about the potential consequences of altering long-standing expectations. The monarchy survived because of continuity. It relied on public confidence, clear traditions, and a sense of permanence. Any major adjustment carried risks. The bigger the change, the greater the uncertainty. And uncertainty was something the institution had spent centuries trying to avoid. For Princess Anne, those concerns felt deeply personal. She devoted her entire life to preserving the stability of the crown. She understood that modernization could be necessary, but she also understood the dangers of moving too quickly. The more details she encountered, the more she found herself questioning where the line should be drawn. Was the king strengthening the institution for the future, or was he unknowingly opening doors that future generations might struggle to close? The questions became even more difficult as additional provisions reportedly surfaced. Certain aspects of the framework appeared to extend influence and responsibility in unexpected directions. Long-held assumptions about royal roles seemed less certain than they once had. The familiar roadmap that had guided the family for decades was beginning to look different, and nobody could fully predict where the new route might lead. What made the situation even more complicated was the growing support Charles appeared to have among key advisors. Some believed the monarchy faced challenges unlike any seen before. Public expectations were evolving. The world around the institution was changing rapidly. According to this view, preserving the monarchy required more than protecting tradition. It required adapting to realities that previous generations never faced. To them, Charles's strategy looked visionary rather than reckless. Yet every endorsement seemed matched by an equally serious warning. Supporters saw preparation. Critics saw potential instability. Supporters saw foresight. Critics saw unintended consequences waiting to emerge years from now. The debate quietly intensified with every passing day, creating an atmosphere of growing tension inside royal circles. Caught between loyalty to her brother and loyalty to the institution she had spent a lifetime serving, Anne found herself facing an uncomfortable truth. The future being discussed was unlike anything she had anticipated. The assumptions that once felt certain now seemed fragile, and as more pieces of the puzzle fell into place, she could no longer avoid the deeper questions that had begun haunting her from the moment she walked out of that secret meeting. As reactions intensified, Anne found herself confronting questions she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. Princess Anne rarely showed emotion in public, but those closest to her recognized the warning signs immediately. Behind her silence was a storm of concern, and behind that concern was a growing belief that the monarchy might be entering dangerous territory. The questions that had begun troubling Anne after the king's secret meeting refused to fade. Instead, they grew heavier with every private discussion, every carefully worded briefing, and every new piece of information that found its way into royal circles. For most of her life, certainty had been one of her greatest strengths. She understood where she stood, what her duty required, and how the institution should respond during moments of uncertainty. But now, for perhaps the first time in years, she found herself wrestling with doubts she could not easily dismiss. Behind closed doors, Anne reportedly began examining the implications of Charles's succession strategy with increasing intensity. What had initially appeared to be a forward-looking plan now seemed filled with consequences that extended far beyond the immediate future. Each detail raised new questions. Each answer seemed to create even greater uncertainty. The deeper she looked, the more she realized that the debate was no longer simply about leadership. It was about identity. It was about deciding what kind of monarchy would survive long after the current generation had passed into history. Trusted advisors and senior courtiers soon became part of these discussions. Conversations that once focused on practical preparations gradually evolved into larger debates about principle, tradition, and continuity. Some argued that Charles was demonstrating remarkable foresight. They believed that adapting to changing times was essential if the institution hoped to remain relevant in the decades ahead. Others were far more cautious. They feared that moving too aggressively could weaken foundations that had taken centuries to build. For Anne, preserving stability remained the central concern. She understood that public confidence in the monarchy depended on more than ceremonies and titles. It depended on trust. It depended on continuity. It depended on the belief that while individual monarchs might come and go, the institution itself remained steady and dependable. That belief had carried the crown through wars, scandals, political upheaval, and personal tragedies. The thought of unintentionally placing that stability at risk weighed heavily on her mind. As the days passed, a deeper tension began emerging between two competing visions of the future. On one side stood the argument for modernization. Supporters believed the monarchy must continue evolving to reflect the world around it. On the other side stood the defenders of tradition, who viewed continuity as the institution's greatest strength. Neither side could fully dismiss the other. Both carried valid concerns. Both believed they were acting in the best interests of the crown. And caught between them stood Princess Anne. The conflict was not merely intellectual, it was deeply personal. Charles was not just the king, he was her brother. They had shared decades of challenges, responsibilities, and sacrifices that few people could truly understand. Loyalty to him came naturally. Yet loyalty to the institution came just as naturally. Throughout her life, Anne had often placed duty above personal feelings. Now she faced perhaps the most difficult version of that test. What happened when loyalty to the monarch and loyalty to the monarchy no longer felt perfectly aligned? Reports of increasingly serious private conversations soon began circulating among those closest to the palace. The discussions were said to be respectful but intense. Every participant understood the stakes. The future of the institution was being examined from every angle, and no possibility seemed too significant to ignore. As more voices entered the debate, the atmosphere surrounding the succession plans became even more charged with uncertainty. Yet amid all the concern, one reality was becoming impossible to overlook. While Anne wrestled with difficult questions and lingering doubts, others inside the royal household appeared far less conflicted. In fact, one senior figure seemed ready to move forward without hesitation, embracing the king's vision with growing confidence. And that development would soon introduce an entirely new dimension to a story that was already reshaping the future of the monarchy. Yet while Anne wrestled with her concerns, another figure inside the palace was preparing to embrace the king's vision completely. As uncertainty spread through royal circles, Prince William found himself at the center of a rapidly changing future. The king's decision placed enormous responsibility on his shoulders, and perhaps even greater expectations on those who would follow him. While Princess Anne continued weighing the risks and consequences of Charles's vision, another reality was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. The future of the monarchy was already beginning to gather around Prince William. What had once seemed like gradual preparation now appeared to be accelerating with remarkable speed. Conversations that previously centered on the king's leadership were increasingly shifting toward what came next, and at the heart of every discussion stood the Prince of Wales. For years, William had been preparing for the responsibilities that would eventually come with the crown. Yet even those closest to him reportedly recognized that something had changed. His role was no longer defined solely by future expectations. More decisions were finding their way to his desk. More strategic discussions included his input. More senior figures were looking toward him for reassurance and direction. The transition that many assumed would unfold over a much longer period suddenly felt far closer than anyone expected. That growing responsibility carried enormous weight. Every generation of royals faces challenges unique to its time, but William's situation appeared especially complicated. He was being asked not only to prepare for kingship, but also to help shape the institution that future generations would inherit. The king's succession framework seemed designed to stretch far beyond immediate concerns, creating a roadmap that would influence the monarchy long after Charles and William themselves became part of history. As preparations quietly expanded, discussions reportedly began extending beyond William's future reign. Attention increasingly turned toward the generations that would follow him. Questions about continuity, stability, and long-term leadership became central topics of debate. The focus was no longer simply on the next monarch. It was on creating a structure capable of guiding the institution decades into the future. That shift in perspective represented one of the most significant aspects of Charles's vision. The younger members of the royal family naturally became part of these conversations. Their future roles, responsibilities, and place within the institution suddenly carried greater importance than before. What once seemed distant now felt remarkably close. Decisions being considered today could influence opportunities, expectations, and responsibilities for generations not yet ready to shoulder them. The scale of the planning reportedly surprised even seasoned palace observers. Publicly, however, little appeared unusual. The royal family continued presenting a united front. Official engagements proceeded as expected. Statements emphasized stability, continuity, and confidence. To most observers, the institution appeared calm and secure. Yet beneath that carefully maintained image, uncertainty continued to grow. The deeper insiders looked into the king's strategy, the more they realized how much was changing behind the scenes. For Anne, this contrast became increasingly difficult to ignore. She watched events unfold with a mixture of admiration and concern. No one doubted William's commitment to duty. No one questioned his dedication to the institution. In many ways, he represented exactly the kind of leadership the monarchy hoped to project. Yet Anne understood that even the most capable leader could be challenged by the consequences of decisions made years earlier. The burden being placed upon William's shoulders was immense, and the expectations surrounding him seemed to grow with every passing day. At the same time, supporters of Charles's plan argued that this was precisely the point. They believed preparation was the greatest gift one generation could give the next. By confronting difficult questions now, they hoped future monarchs would inherit greater clarity and stability. To them, the king's strategy represented responsibility rather than risk. But critics remained unconvinced, warning that even carefully designed plans could produce outcomes nobody intended. As these competing perspectives continued to clash, William found himself increasingly positioned as the bridge between tradition and transformation. The success or failure of Charles's vision might ultimately depend on how effectively he navigated the path being laid before him. Yet even as attention focused on William and the future he would inherit, one final piece of the puzzle remained hidden from public view. And when that final piece eventually emerged, it would leave even the most experienced royal observers struggling to comprehend the scale of what Charles had truly set in motion. Because the story was never just about William, never just about succession, and never just about the next reign. But the real shock was still to come, because the final element of Charles's plan revealed a future that few had imagined possible. When the final details surfaced, even seasoned palace veterans struggled to hide their surprise. The succession plan was no longer simply about the next monarch. It was about defining the monarchy's identity for generations. The atmosphere surrounding the palace changed almost immediately. What had begun as quiet speculation among a handful of insiders was now evolving into something far larger. The final pieces of King Charles's succession strategy were reportedly starting to emerge, and with every new revelation, the true scale of his vision became harder to ignore. Even individuals who had spent decades navigating royal transitions found themselves caught off guard. They had expected preparation. They had expected planning. What they had not expected was a framework that appeared designed to influence the monarchy far beyond the next reign. At the heart of these newly surfaced details was an increased focus on future heirs. For generations, succession planning largely concentrated on immediate transitions. The next monarch was prepared, supported, and positioned to assume responsibility when the time came. Charles's reported strategy seemed different. It looked beyond the next crown and beyond the next generation. It attempted to establish a direction that would shape the institution decades into the future, creating expectations and responsibilities for heirs who still had many years before such burdens would normally reach them. That shift immediately intensified the debate already taking place behind palace walls. Supporters argued that the monarchy needed exactly this kind of long-term thinking. The world was changing rapidly. Public expectations were evolving. Future generations would face challenges unlike those confronted by previous monarchs. In their view, Charles was acting as a steward of the institution, ensuring that future heirs inherited not uncertainty but preparation. Yet critics remained deeply uneasy. They questioned whether any monarch, regardless of intention, could realistically design a future so far in advance. Traditions survived because they allowed each generation to adapt to circumstances as they emerged. Attempting to define too early, they argued, carried risks that could not be fully anticipated. What looked like stability today might create complications tomorrow. What seemed visionary in one era could appear restrictive in another. For Princess Anne, these concerns reportedly carried particular weight. By this stage, she had spent considerable time examining the broader implications of Charles's strategy. While she understood the desire to strengthen the monarchy's future, certain provisions reportedly stood out as especially significant. They hinted at a level of long-term planning that went beyond routine preparation. To Anne, the issue was no longer simply whether change was necessary. The question had become whether the balance between continuity and transformation was being pushed too far. As more information circulated, divisions quietly deepened among senior courtiers and advisors. Two competing perspectives began emerging. One group viewed the king's vision as a bold attempt to future-proof the institution. They believed strong leadership required anticipating challenges before they arrived. Another group worried that the monarchy was entering unfamiliar territory. They feared that reshaping expectations too dramatically could create uncertainty, where stability had always been the crown's greatest strength. Meanwhile, palace officials worked tirelessly to maintain an appearance of calm. Publicly, the message remained consistent. The monarchy was stable. The institution was functioning as expected. Preparations for the future were routine and responsible. Yet behind that carefully managed image, conversations were growing increasingly intense. Every new rumor generated fresh questions. Every unanswered question fueled additional speculation. What made the situation even more remarkable was how quickly private whispers began escaping into broader discussion. The boundaries between confidential debate and public curiosity were becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. Journalists, commentators, and royal observers all sensed that something significant was unfolding. Nobody possessed the complete picture, but everyone understood that the future of the monarchy was being shaped in real time. And as the final details continued spreading beyond the palace gates, one reality became impossible to escape. King Charles's plan had evolved into far more than a succession strategy. It had become a vision for the monarchy itself, a vision that would soon face its greatest test as questions once confined to private meetings began, demanding public answers. As whispers became headlines, the monarchy faced a critical question. Would Charles's vision strengthen the crown, or test it like never before? What began as a confidential succession discussion soon evolved into one of the most sensitive family debates of Charles's reign. At stake was not only power, but the very legacy each royal hoped to leave behind. By the time speculation surrounding King Charles's succession strategy reached its highest point, the conversation had expanded far beyond questions of planning and preparation. What had started as a private examination of the monarchy's future was now becoming something far more personal. Beneath the discussions about institutions, traditions, and future generations lay a deeper reality. Every member of the royal family understood that history was being written in real time. The decisions being debated would not only shape the crown, they would shape how each individual involved would ultimately be remembered. Senior family members reportedly found themselves drawn into increasingly serious conversations about the implications of the king's vision. Some approached the matter cautiously, seeking clarity about how future generations would be affected. Others focused on the practical realities of implementing such an ambitious framework. Yet beneath every discussion lingered the same fundamental question. Was the monarchy being strengthened for the future, or was it being pushed toward an uncertain transformation whose consequences could not yet be fully understood? As these conversations continued, emotions reportedly began surfacing in ways that surprised even those accustomed to royal disagreements. The debate was no longer taking place solely on a constitutional level. It had become deeply personal. Every viewpoint reflected years of experience, sacrifice, and belief about what the institution should represent. Long-held assumptions were being challenged. Familiar certainties were becoming less secure. And as tensions quietly grew, so too did the stakes. For Princess Anne, the situation remained especially difficult. Throughout her life, she had often served as a stabilizing force during periods of uncertainty. Yet now she found herself increasingly concerned about the institutional risks she believed might accompany certain aspects of the king's strategy. Her concerns were not rooted in opposition for its own sake. They stemmed from a profound commitment to continuity and stability. Anne understood better than most that the crown's greatest strength had always been its ability to endure. Any change, no matter how well-intentioned, had to be measured against that reality. Charles, however, reportedly remained unwavering. The more questions emerged, the more determined he appeared to be. Those close to the discussions suggested that he viewed the strategy not as a departure from his responsibilities but as their fulfillment. He believed that preparing the monarchy for future challenges was one of the most important duties of his reign. To him, the difficult conversations unfolding around him were proof that the institution was confronting necessary questions rather than avoiding them. Caught between these competing perspectives stood Prince William. His position was uniquely challenging. On one side was his father, the reigning monarch whose vision would shape the years ahead. On the other stood respected voices, urging caution and emphasizing the importance of preserving established traditions. William reportedly worked carefully to understand both viewpoints, recognizing the merits and risks present in each argument. More than anyone else, he understood that the consequences of today's decisions might ultimately become his responsibility to manage. As the discussions intensified, a delicate balance emerged. No one wanted division. No one wanted instability. Yet agreement proved increasingly difficult to achieve. Every proposed solution seemed to generate new questions. Every reassurance was met with fresh concerns. The future of the monarchy appeared suspended between competing interpretations of what duty truly required. Outside the palace, the public continued seeing an image of unity and confidence. Inside, however, profound questions about legacy, leadership, and long-term stability remained unresolved. The debates were respectful but increasingly significant. Every participant understood that the outcome would influence the monarchy for decades. What made the moment so extraordinary was not the existence of disagreement itself. It was the realization that every side genuinely believed it was acting in the institution's best interests. And as the debate continued approaching its most critical stage, something unexpected began happening. The arguments themselves started revealing a larger truth, one that stretched beyond succession plans, beyond royal roles, and even beyond the reign of King Charles. Slowly, a final realization began emerging from the uncertainty. And as the debate reached its peak, a final realization began to emerge, one that would redefine how history remembered this moment. In the end, the king's final succession decision was never simply about names, titles, or position. It was about the kind of monarchy he believed should survive long after he was gone, and whether those closest to him could accept that vision. As the intense debates slowly began to settle, a clearer picture started to emerge from the uncertainty that had consumed royal circles for weeks. The arguments, concerns, and disagreements had never truly been about individual roles. They had never been solely about who would hold power or how responsibilities would be distributed. Beneath every discussion was a much larger question. What kind of monarchy would endure in the decades ahead, and what sacrifices would be required to ensure its survival? King Charles remained firmly committed to the strategy he had developed. Despite the concerns raised by trusted advisors, despite the difficult conversations with senior members of his family, and despite the growing speculations surrounding his intentions, he appeared convinced that his vision represented the best path forward. To those closest to him, the plan was not an attempt to control the future. It was an effort to prepare for it. Charles understood that every monarch eventually becomes part of history. What mattered was whether the institution itself remained strong after they were gone. For Princess Anne, that realization came gradually. Throughout the process, she had focused on the risks, the uncertainties, and the potential consequences that might emerge from such an ambitious framework. Her caution came from experience, and from a lifetime devoted to protecting the crown. Yet as the broader purpose behind the strategy became clearer, she reportedly began to see the situation from a different perspective. She did not necessarily abandon every concern she had raised, but she increasingly recognized that Charles was motivated by a desire to strengthen the institution rather than reshape it for personal reasons. That understanding did not eliminate every question. In many ways, it created new ones. The monarchy now stood at the threshold of a new era defined by preparation, adaptation, and transition. Long-standing assumptions were evolving. Future responsibilities were being reconsidered. The groundwork for generations yet to come was being carefully discussed long before those generations would inherit it. The institution was preparing not just for the next chapter, but for an entirely different age. Yet uncertainty remained. No plan, regardless of how carefully constructed, could guarantee success. Future generations would ultimately make their own decisions. They would face challenges impossible to predict and circumstances no advisor could fully anticipate. The choices being made today might provide guidance, but they could never eliminate the unpredictability of tomorrow. That reality lingered over every discussion, serving as a reminder that even the most thoughtful strategy would eventually be tested by time. At the center of that future stood Prince William. More than anyone else, he embodied the connection between the monarchy's past and its future. He carried the traditions that had defined the institution for centuries, while also representing the changes necessary to ensure its continued relevance. Throughout the succession debate, he had worked to understand competing viewpoints, balancing loyalty, responsibility, and long-term vision. In many ways, William became the bridge that allowed different generations of royal thinking to coexist. As the dust slowly settled, another truth became impossible to ignore. King Charles's legacy would forever be tied to the decisions he had made during this critical period. Future historians would not simply evaluate his reign through ceremonies, speeches, or public appearances. They would examine the framework he attempted to leave behind. They would study whether his vision strengthened the institution or created challenges, that later generations struggled to overcome. The succession strategy had become more than a plan. It had become an inseparable part of his story, and perhaps that is what makes this moment so significant. Beyond the debates, beyond the disagreements, and beyond the uncertainty, it revealed something timeless about the monarchy itself. Every generation inherits a responsibility greater than any individual. Every monarch must decide what they will leave behind. Every heir must determine how that legacy will be carried forward. Because while crowns may pass from one generation to the next, the real battle has always been over the future they are meant to protect. And that story is only beginning. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.